On September 19th, 1944, First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper was jolted awake at 7:30 in the morning by the sound of frantic shouting. He was somewhere in Lorraine, France, commanding 4 tank destroyers that weighed less than a German staff car filled with officers. His vehicles had half an inch of armor. A rifle bullet could punch through them at close range. And in approximately 15 minutes, he would face more than a dozen German Panther tanks, each weighing 3 times what his machines weighed, each carrying guns that could vaporize his entire platoon from a mile away. 7,000 miles from that muddy French hillside, in a tank factory in Flint, Michigan, a team of automobile engineers had designed the vehicle Leiper was about to take into battle. They had envisioned something radical, something fast, something that violated every principle of armored warfare the Germans believed in. The established tank commanders said it would never work. The doctrine it embodied had been called impractical by an American general. The crews who rode in it called it a death trap. The Germans believed their heavy tanks were invincible. Lieutenant Leiper and his 4 M18 Hellcats were about to prove them catastrophically wrong. The myth of German tank invincibility began long before the first American tank destroyer rolled off the assembly line. When Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg across France in 1940, the world watched in horror as armored columns sliced through defensive lines that had been considered impenetrable. The panzer divisions moved with a speed and violence that shattered every assumption about modern warfare. Nations that had spent decades building fortifications saw those fortifications bypassed in hours. The French army, which had more tanks than Germany and many that were technically superior, collapsed in 6 weeks. The German army understood the psychological impact of their success. They cultivated it deliberately. Nazi propaganda transformed the Panzer into a symbol of German technological and moral superiority. Newsreels showed columns of tanks rolling through conquered territories while defeated soldiers marched into captivity. The message was unmistakable. German armor was unstoppable. When the Tiger tank entered service in August 1942, the propaganda ministry of Joseph Goebbels turned it into the ultimate symbol of that superiority. The Tiger weighed 57 tons. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, sloped at a mere 10 degrees because German engineers believed sheer thickness would defeat any weapon. Its 88mm gun, derived from the legendary anti-aircraft weapon that had terrorized Allied bombers, could destroy any tank in the world at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. German newsreels showed Tigers advancing through Russian snowfields and African deserts, unstoppable monuments to engineering excellence. The first Tigers saw combat at Leningrad in late 1942, where they achieved initial successes that seemed to justify every claim the propaganda ministry had made. At Tabourba in Tunisia in December of that year, 3 Tigers from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, working alongside the 10th Panzer Division and Luftwaffe support, helped destroy 134 of 182. Allied tanks, including American armor from Combat Command B of the 1st Armored Division. The survivors carried tales of an unstoppable monster back to their comrades. The psychological impact spread faster than the tanks themselves. The training manual issued to Tiger crews was unlike anything the military had produced before. Called the Tiger Fibel, it was written by a lieutenant named Josef von Glatter-Goetz and authorized by General Heinz Guderian himself. It featured risque illustrations of a blonde woman called Elvira Tiger, depicted in various states of undress while explaining mechanical procedures. It used limericks and comic book panels to teach technical information that would have been presented in dry technical language in any other army. Crews loved it. The manual became a collector's item. But buried within its playful pages was a message delivered with absolute seriousness. The Tiger was superior to any tank it would face. No enemy vehicle could defeat it in direct combat. Tank aces emerged as celebrities in the German press, their kill counts published like sports statistics. The most famous was SS Captain Michael Wittmann, who earned the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords for his kill count on the Eastern Front. His photograph appeared in magazines and newspapers throughout Germany. After the Battle of Villers-Bocage in June 1944, German reports credited him with destroying between 20 and 27 British vehicles in a single 15-minute engagement. The magazine Signal published photographs that made the destruction look even more dramatic than it was. Later analysis by British historians would suggest the actual number was closer to 12 or 14, with many vehicles abandoned rather than destroyed. The photographs themselves had been doctored, with 3 separate images joined together to exaggerate the scale of destruction. SS General Sepp Dietrich understood the value of such propaganda. The Waffen-SS and the regular Wehrmacht competed constantly for resources, and battlefield victories translated directly into manufacturing priority. Every exaggerated claim served a bureaucratic purpose as well as a psychological one. Historian John Buckley would later note that many historians through to today continue to repackage unquestioningly Nazi propaganda about Tiger performance. The effect on Allied crews was measurable and documented by military psychologists. British commanders in Normandy reported that their tank crews assumed every German vehicle they encountered was a Tiger, regardless of what it actually was. Panzer IVs were reported as Tigers. Even assault guns were sometimes reported as Tigers. The phenomenon acquired a clinical name, Tigerphobia. Reports of Tiger sightings multiplied beyond any possible reality. There were never more than 200 Tigers on the entire Western Front, yet reports suggested they were everywhere. Montgomery himself allegedly banned reports that mentioned the Tiger's capabilities, concerned about the damage to morale among his tank crews. British tankers wrote home about the inferiority of their own vehicles, letters that were intercepted by censors and flagged for the attention of senior commanders. On the Eastern Front, Soviet T-34 crews reportedly withdrew from areas based on mere suspicion that Tigers might be present, even when no Tigers had been confirmed. But the German analysis of their own superiority contained a fatal flaw that would only become apparent when tested against an enemy who thought about armoured warfare in completely different terms. They measured tank effectiveness by the capabilities of individual machines. They counted armour thickness and muzzle velocity and kill ratios achieved by elite crews in ideal conditions. They did not measure what would happen when they faced an opponent who refused to play by their rules. The Americans were building something the Germans never anticipated. The vehicle that would challenge German assumptions was born from one of the most contentious debates in American military history. After France fell in 1940, the United States Army faced a terrifying question. How could infantry divisions stop a blitzkrieg? The panzers had proven that defensive lines meant nothing against concentrated armor. Traditional anti-tank guns, towed behind trucks and set up in static positions, had been overrun before their crews could fire a shot. The German tactics of combined arms, warfare, using tanks, infantry, and aircraft in coordinated attacks, had made every existing defensive doctrine obsolete. The answer proposed by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair was revolutionary. McNair commanded Army Ground Forces, and George Marshall called him the brains of the Army. His idea was simple in concept and radical in execution. Instead of building tanks to fight tanks, which was expensive and time-consuming, America would build specialized tank destroyers. These machines would be faster than any tank, carry guns powerful enough to kill one, but deliberately sacrifice armor for speed. They would not slug it out in direct combat the way German tanks did. They would ambush from concealed positions, strike before the enemy could react, and vanish before return fire could find them. The concept emerged from careful study of German tactics. The blitzkrieg worked by concentrating armor at unexpected points and punching through before defenders could respond. McNair reasoned that mobile tank destroyer battalions, held in reserve and rushed to threatened sectors, could blunt these armored spearheads before they broke through. The key was speed. Tank destroyers had to move faster than the panzers they would hunt. The officer chosen to turn this vision into reality was Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce. A graduate of Texas A&M and a decorated veteran of the First World War, Bruce had served in every major action of the 2nd Division during that conflict. He had been wounded in combat and understood what it meant to face superior firepower with inadequate protection. He was appointed to command the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center on November 27, 1941, just 10 days before Pearl Harbor changed everything about America's relationship with the war. He would be promoted to Brigadier General in early 1942 and Major General that September. Bruce envisioned his tank destroyers as cruisers rather than battleships. Naval warfare had long recognized that heavily armored ships traded speed for protection, while lighter vessels sacrificed armor for mobility. Bruce applied the same logic to ground combat. His tank destroyers would be the cruisers of land warfare, fast enough to choose their engagements and maneuver around slower opponents. He selected Killeen, Texas, as the site for his training center, designating it Camp Hood. The facility sprawled across hundreds of thousands of acres of Texas scrubland. At peak capacity, it would train 100,000 soldiers simultaneously. The doctrine Bruce developed was codified in Field Manual 18-5, published on June 16, 1942. Its opening statement left no room for ambiguity. There is but one battle objective of tank destroyer units, this being plainly inferred by their designation. It is the destruction of hostile tanks. The motto Bruce chose for his force was equally direct: seek, strike, and destroy. It would be painted on vehicles, printed on shoulder patches, and drilled into every soldier who passed through Camp Hood. The opposition from within the American military was fierce and came from officers who would later become famous. Major General Jacob Devers, commanding the armored force, declared flatly that the separate tank destroyer arm was not a practical concept on the battlefield. Offensively, he argued, the weapon to beat a tank is another tank. Devers pushed for heavier American tanks like the M18 Pershing and went over McNair's head to Marshall to make his case. He believed that concentration of resources on a separate tank destroyer force would weaken the armored divisions that would actually win the war. General Patton, after observing tank destroyers in their first major engagement at El Guetar in Tunisia in March 1943, called the concept unsuccessful in the conditions of the theatre. At El Guetar, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 37 German tanks in what should have been a triumphant validation of the doctrine. But the battalion had lost 21 of its 31 serviceable M3 gun motor carriages in the process. Patton saw the exchange as Pyrrhic and questioned whether lightly armoured tank destroyers could survive modern combat. Armoured branch officers claimed that the 1941 Louisiana manoeuvres that had validated the tank destroyer concept had been rigged to produce favourable results. They alleged that umpires had ruled in favour of tank destroyers in situations where tanks would actually have prevailed. The debate became bitter enough that it threatened to derail the entire programme. But Bruce pressed forward with support from McNair and Marshall. The vehicle that would embody his doctrine was designed by Harley Earl's team at the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Earl was famous for designing sleek, stylish automobiles. His team applied automotive engineering principles to a weapon of war, treating the tank destroyer like a high-performance vehicle rather than a traditional military machine. It was tested at the same proving ground in Milford, Michigan, where Buick tested its passenger cars, driven around the same tracks where prototypes of Buick Roadmasters had been evaluated. Development moved at a pace that would have been impossible for the methodical German procurement system. From the initial requirement in December 1941 through 4 different gun calibers, 37mm to 57 to 75 to 76, the first T-70 pilot vehicle rolled out in April 1943, 16 months from concept to prototype. By comparison, the Tiger had taken nearly 4 years from initial requirement to combat deployment. The final design weighed 18 tons, less than a third of the Tiger's weight. It could reach 55 miles per hour on roads, making it the fastest tracked armoured vehicle of the war. Its Continental R975 radial engine, manufactured under license from Wright Aeronautical, produced 350 to 400 horsepower depending on the variant. The engine was air-cooled rather than water-cooled, eliminating the radiator and its vulnerability to damage. Its 76mm M1A1 gun could penetrate the side armour of a Panther at over 1,000 metres. The mathematics of penetration were carefully calculated. With standard M62 armour-piercing capped ammunition, the 76mm gun could penetrate the Tiger's 100mm frontal hull from approximately 600 metres, aiming for the driver's plate. The turret front could be penetrated at around 700 metres. Side armour, which was 60 to 80 millimetres thick, could be penetrated at ranges beyond 1,000 metres. With the scarce M93 high-velocity armour-piercing rounds, which were issued at only 2 or 3 rounds per vehicle per month, frontal penetration was possible at greater distances. But the design choices that made the Hellcat fast also made it vulnerable. Its hull armour was 12.7 millimetres thick, half an inch. Testing showed that 9 out of 30 armour-piercing 30-caliber rifle bullets penetrated the turret side at just 75 yards. The turret was open-topped, leaving the crew exposed to artillery fragments and grenades. There was no machine gun in the hull for close defence. The crews who would fight in these machines understood exactly what this meant. They were sitting in vehicles that could not survive a direct hit from anything larger than a machine gun. A Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy a Hellcat at any range where combat was likely to occur. The asymmetry was absolute. Their protection was not armor, it was speed. If they were caught in the open by a German tank, they would die. Buick's publicity department gave the vehicle its name, the M18 Hellcat. Earl's designers also created the Wildcat logo that would be painted on production vehicles. Between July 1943 and October 1944, 2,507 units rolled off the assembly line in Flint. The men who crewed these machines came from farms and factories across America. Many had never seen a tank before they entered the army. Few had fired a weapon in combat. The training programs at Camp Hood ran continuously, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, turning civilians into tank destroyer crews in a matter of weeks. Captain Thomas Evans, who would later command C Company of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, recalled that during testing at Camp Maxey, they ran those things day in and day out, night and day, just to see what they would do. A Buick engineer was embedded with the crews for 6 weeks to incorporate their suggestions into production modifications. What the crews learned was unorthodox and contradicted everything conventional armored doctrine taught. They were taught to fire and immediately move, never staying in the same position long enough for the enemy to zero in on them. They were taught to use terrain obsessively, to find hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed, to use ridgelines and buildings and trees as cover. They learned that Panther turrets traversed so slowly, using a hand crank rather than powered traverse, that 4 or 5 rounds could be fired before the German gun could be brought to bear. They learned that a well-placed shot between the mantlet and glacis plate of a Panther would ricochet into the driving compartment, killing the crew. They were taught that in a fair fight against German heavy armor, they would lose. Their job was to ensure the fight was never fair. McNair did not live to see his doctrine fully tested in large-scale combat. On July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra, he was killed by friendly fire when American bombers dropped short of their targets near St. Louis. Over 100 American soldiers died in the incident, but McNair was the highest-ranking American killed in combat during the entire war. His death removed the most powerful institutional champion of the tank destroyer concept, but by then, the Hellcats were already in France, and they were about to face the ultimate test. In September 1944, the German army launched a counteroffensive in Lorraine, France, that was designed to halt Patton's Third Army and stabilize the Western Front. The rapid American advance across France had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Patton's tanks were running out of fuel. Hitler saw an opportunity to strike while the Americans were overextended. General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army committed 262 armored fighting vehicles to the attack. 75 Panzer IVs, with their reliable 75mm guns. 107 Panthers with their deadly high-velocity weapons and sloped armor. 80 assault guns for infantry support. The force was organized around 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th, along with the veteran 11th Panzer Division. These units had been rebuilt with fresh crews and new equipment, specifically for this offensive. Their target was Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, one of Patton's elite units commanded by Colonel Bruce C. Clark. The Americans fielded 163 tanks, mostly M4 Shermans, plus the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion's 36 M18 Hellcats. The battalion had lost its commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Bailey, on the first day of fighting. Above them in the chain of command stood Major General John S. Wood, known as Tiger Jack, commanding the 4th Armored Division, and Major General Manton Eddy commanding the 12th Corps. Patton himself was watching closely from 3rd Army headquarters. The German plan was straightforward. Overwhelm the Americans with superior numbers and heavier armor, break through their lines, and cut Patton's supply routes. General Heinrich von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps conducting the assault. German commanders expected the attack to succeed within days. They did not account for the Hellcats. The morning of September 19th began with dense fog that reduced visibility to just a few feet. The weather favored neither side. German tanks could not see targets at range, but neither could American gunners. Lieutenant Leiper's 3rd Platoon of C Company was resting near the village of Réchicourt-la-Petite when a frantic alert came through. German armor had been spotted moving toward American positions. Captain William Dwight, the liaison officer from the 37th Tank Battalion, organized a blocking force and led Leiper's 4 M18s toward Hill 246. At approximately 7:45, Leiper spotted something through the fog that made his blood freeze. A German tank gun muzzle materializing out of the grey murk. It was 30 feet away. Close enough to read the manufacturer's markings on the barrel. Close enough to see the German commander's face in his cupola. The next 5 minutes would validate everything Andrew Bruce had designed the Hellcat to do. Leiper's gunner fired first. The 76mm shell struck the Panther before its crew even realized they were under attack. The German turret, hand-cranked and painfully slow to traverse, never got a shot off. The Hellcat was already moving to a new position by the time the Panther's ammunition cooked off in a secondary explosion. In the chaos that followed, Leiper's platoon destroyed 5 Panthers before losing a single vehicle. The fog that should have been neutral worked in favor of the faster American vehicles. The Hellcats could reposition between shots faster than the German gunners could locate them. Sergeant Henry Hartman, with private first-class Amodio firing, became a one-man wrecking crew. From positions the Germans could not pinpoint through the fog, Hartman's Hellcat engaged target after target. His vehicle would fire, and before the echo died, it would lurch backward at full speed, racing to a new firing position before the smoke cleared. By the time the engagement ended, Hartman had personally accounted for 6 German tanks. Most had been destroyed before their crews could even turn their guns toward the sound of firing. By the time Leiper withdrew from Hill 246 with his 1 surviving Hellcat, 15 German tanks lay burning on the hillside. 3 M18s had been lost, but the 113th Panzer Brigade had been torn apart. Across the broader battle that day, the American forces delivered devastation that shocked German commanders who had expected easy victory. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, for whom the M1 Abrams tank would later be named, led the 37th Tank Battalion in destroying 29 additional enemy tanks. Abrams was already developing a reputation as an aggressive commander who led from the front. His Shermans worked in coordination with the Hellcats, with the M18s drawing German attention while the Shermans maneuvered for flank shots. Captain Kenneth Lamison of C Company raced 4 Shermans 3,000 yards to a commanding ridge, arriving 3 minutes before 8 Panthers appeared in his sights. The German crews never saw where the fire was coming from. Lamison knocked out 4 before they could return fire, then withdrew before the survivors could regroup. The 113th Panzer Brigade's commander, Colonel Erich von Seckendorf, was killed 4 days later, on September 23rd near Lagarde, while trying to rally his shattered unit. His brigade had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The crews who survived reported that they could not understand what was happening. Enemy vehicles appeared, fired, and vanished before they could respond. Captain Thomas Evans commanded C Company of the 704th throughout these engagements. He would later earn the Distinguished Service Cross on November 22, 1944, near Moyenvic, France, when he personally manned the gun of a disabled M18 and knocked out 2 German tanks while under fire. His oral history, Reluctant Valor, published by St. Vincent College in 1995, remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of M18 combat. By the time the Battle of Arracourt ended on September 29th, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German tanks, while losing only 4 M18s, with 3 more damaged. That was an exchange ratio of nearly 10-1. Of the 262 German armoured vehicles that had begun the counteroffensive, only 62 remained operational by month's end. Combat Command A had lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers total. The German attempt to halt Patton's advance had been crushed so thoroughly that it would never be attempted again in that sector. But the ultimate test was yet to come, and it would take place in conditions far more desperate than anything the Hellcat crews had yet experienced. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its last major offensive in the West. 3 German armies with 300,000 troops and over 1,000 tanks crashed through the thinly defended Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate against the Soviet Union. The American forces in the path of this onslaught were caught completely by surprise. Intelligence had failed to detect the massive German buildup. Many of the divisions in the Ardennes were either fresh units with no combat experience or exhausted veteran units sent there to rest and refit. They were not prepared for the largest German offensive since 1940. The town of Bastogne sat at the junction of 7 major roads in the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the movement of supplies and reinforcements across a critical section of the front. The Germans needed to take it quickly to maintain the momentum of their advance. The Americans could not afford to lose it. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Templeton, received orders to move south on December 19th. They made a harrowing 60-mile road march through roads clogged with retreating soldiers and refugees. They arrived at Bastogne late that night, just as German forces were beginning to encircle the town. The unit was formally attached to the 101st Airborne Division, which had no organic tank support of its own. The paratroopers had been rushed to Bastogne so quickly that many arrived without winter clothing or adequate ammunition. The 36 M18s of the 705th would provide the only significant armoured capability for the encircled Americans. Everything depended on whether those thin-skinned vehicles could hold against the German assault. At Neuville, just north of Bastogne, elements of the 705th and a platoon from the 609th Tank Destroyer Battalion C Company joined a mixed force called Team de Sobry. Named after its commander, they faced the 2nd Panzer Division, one of Germany's elite armoured units. What followed was a desperate defensive action that relied on exactly the tactics the Hellcat had been designed for. The M18s could not survive a stand-up fight against the German assault. The Panzers outnumbered them and outweighed them, so the Hellcat crews did not try to fight fairly. Instead, they made constant position changes after firing, sprinting at full speed between covered locations, appearing from unexpected directions, and vanishing before the Germans could respond. The German commander, unable to fix the location of the American armour, became convinced that the village was defended by a far larger force than actually existed. He requested reinforcements and artillery support for what he believed was a major American defensive position. In reality, there were only a handful of tank destroyers and a mixed bag of paratroopers and tankers. The defenders at Neuville destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted between 500 and 1,000 casualties before being forced to withdraw on December 20th. On Christmas Day, 1944-18, Panzer IVs from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division attacked toward the village of Champs on the Bastogne perimeter. Sergeant Lawrence Valletta of the Reconnaissance Company rolled his Hellcat directly into the village during the assault. He demolished a stone house, sheltering approximately 30 German soldiers, firing his 76mm gun at point-blank range into the structure. He destroyed 2 more buildings and smashed 4 machine gun nests at ranges so close that the German crews could see his face. Then he withdrew at full speed before the German tanks could respond. That day, all 18 attacking German tanks were destroyed while the 705th lost 2 M18s. The 705th employed innovative tactics throughout the siege. At night, they used ground flares to illuminate advancing German armour. When 3 panzers attempted to reinforce an infantry assault along the Neuf-Wardin road, the Hellcats lit the area with flares and destroyed all 3 before they reached the American lines. By the time Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed approximately 40 German tanks while losing 6 M18s. Lieutenant Colonel Templeton would be killed in action on March 1st, 1945, but his battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions during the siege. The 609th C Company claimed 19 enemy tanks and self-propelled guns destroyed for the loss of just 2 M18s, 2 armoured cars, and 4 jeeps and trucks. These numbers represented a level of efficiency that German commanders had never anticipated. Their own planning assumptions had been built around exchange ratios that favoured the heavier, better armoured German vehicles. What they encountered instead was an opponent who refused to engage on terms that favoured armour. The courage of the men who crewed these thin-skinned vehicles deserves recognition that history has largely failed to provide. Sergeant Roger Turcan of a company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, earned the Silver Star at Rennes when his America 18, vehicle number 13, and the battalion's first loss, was hit and caught fire. 3 of his crewmen were killed instantly. Turcan survived the impact and the flames. Then, alone in a burning vehicle surrounded by the enemy, he loaded and fired all 20 remaining rounds of ammunition single-handedly, neutralizing the SS gun position that had destroyed his Hellcat before escaping through enemy fire. Sergeant John Prusacek of B Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and Technician 4th Grade Harry Traynor were best friends who crewed a Hellcat named Blondie after Prusacek's blonde wife Viola. On February 9, 1945, in the Banholz woods of Germany, 2 Panther tanks destroyed their vehicle. Prusacek, who had earned the Silver Star just 1 day earlier, was killed. Traynor survived with wounds that would trouble him for the rest of his life. Prusacek is buried at the United States Military Cemetery in Hamm, Luxembourg. 50 years later, in 1995, a Luxembourg citizen found Prusacek's engraved canteen cup in the woods near where he had died, and returned it to Traynor. Staff Sergeant Clyde Lee Choate of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion earned the Medal of Honor on October 25, 1944, near Bruyères, France. His battalion used M10 tank destroyers rather than M18s, but his courage exemplified the spirit of the entire tank destroyer force. When his M10 was set ablaze by 2 hits from a Panzer IV, he ordered his crew to abandon it. Then he returned through enemy fire to search for trapped crewmen. Seeing the German tank overrunning American infantry positions, Choate grabbed a bazooka and stalked the Panzer from tree to tree. He fired from 20 yards to immobilize it. He ran back for another rocket, advanced to 10 yards, and shattered the turret. He killed 2 emerging German crewmen with his pistol and dropped a grenade through the hatch. Born in West Frankfort, Illinois, one of 12 children of a coal miner, Choate returned home to a hero's welcome. President Truman encouraged him to enter politics. He served 30 years in the Illinois House of Representatives before his death in 2001 at age 81. Norbert Gerling, a gunner in C Company of the 609th, travelled 1,200 miles across Europe in his M18. At Trier on March 7, 1945, when a disabled American tank was pinned down by a German anti-tank gun hidden under a railway overpass, Gerling's Hellcat entered the killing zone in a cluster of 4 vehicles. Using the 10 power scope on his gun sight, he fired 7 or 8 76mm rounds at the overpass supports, collapsing the structure onto the German gun. He earned the Bronze Star and was interviewed at age 95 for the book The Lucky Ones. What the crews disliked about their vehicles was telling. The open top created what one officer called a large armor-plated refrigerator in winter. The air-cooled engine drew cooling air through the crew compartment, which was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds when temperatures dropped below freezing. The 50 caliber machine gun mount required the commander to fully expose himself to fire it. The 76mm muzzle blast kicked up enough dust to blind the crew between shots. And, as one Army assessment bluntly stated, frontal fire beyond 300 yards would have little effect on the heavy German tanks. They knew this. They fought anyway. The statistics that emerged after the war revealed the truth about what these crews had accomplished. The M18 Hellcat achieved an overall kill ratio of 2.4 to 1 against German armor. This was the highest ratio achieved by any American tank or tank destroyer during the conflict. The total verified kills numbered 526, with 498 in the European theater, 17 in Italy, and 11 in the Pacific. Against this, 216 Hellcats were lost. The peak strength of M18s in Europe reached 540 vehicles in March 1945. Only 3 battalions, the 603rd, the 704th, and the 705th, were combat-ready for the Normandy invasion. All 3 were assigned to Patton's Third Army, because General Bradley had refused the M18 in favor of the older M10 and M36. The German losses told their own story of mechanical failure as deadly as combat. Of approximately 1,700 Tigers produced during the war, including both Tiger I and Tiger II variants, 68% were lost on the Eastern Front, 21% on the Western Front, 9% in Italy, and 2% in North Africa. Analysis of total Tiger losses revealed that only 40% were confirmed combat losses. 38% were non-combat losses from abandonment, mechanical failure, or running out of fuel. The remainder could not be determined. The mechanical reality of German heavy armor was brutal. The Tiger's Maybach engine had been rushed into production without all the bugs being worked out. In the first years of service, mechanical failures killed more Tigers than combat did. The interleaved road wheels that gave the Tiger its smooth ride froze solid with mud, ice, and snow on the eastern front. Crews sometimes had to light fires under their vehicles to thaw them out. Fuel consumption ran to approximately 5 gallons per mile in combat conditions. The Tiger's weight made most bridges impassable and required special narrow transport tracks for rail movement, with outer road wheels removed. The German High Command itself recognized that their reported kill ratios were inflated. They applied reduction factors that grew from 20% in 1942 to 50% from July 1943 onward. Even with reductions, German unit claims showed a 42% over-claim rate against verified Soviet losses. Otto Carius, credited with over 100 kills and author of the memoir Tigers in the Mud, later revised his own count downward to approximately 100 or fewer, admitting he had not counted kills carefully as a commander. His famous engagement at Malinava in July 1944, where he claimed to have destroyed 17 IS-2s and 5 T-34s, was questioned by Soviet archives that showed only about 15 tanks lost in that area from all causes. After the war, Carius opened a pharmacy in Germany called the Tiger Apotheke. The production numbers revealed an industrial disparity that Germany could never overcome. America built 2,507 meters. Germany built approximately 1,300 Tiger 1s and 480 Tiger 2s. Each Tiger cost over 250,000 Reichsmarks, 4 times the cost of a Stug 3 assault gun. The production capacity that built nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks could replace losses faster than Germany could manufacture new vehicles. And while German tank aces accumulated impressive individual kill counts, the aggregate effect of thousands of American armored vehicles overwhelmed whatever qualitative advantages Germany possessed. The doctrine that Andrew Bruce had championed was judged harshly after the war ended. Dr. Christopher Gable's definitive 1985 study, published as Leavenworth Paper No. 12, concluded that tank destroyer doctrine was fundamentally flawed, created with an imperfect understanding of combined arms, mechanized warfare to solve a problem that did not exist as perceived. Infantry division commanders unanimously said they would prefer a tank battalion to a tank destroyer battalion. Yet the paradox remains. The M18 achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in the war. The doctrine failed as doctrine. Tank destroyer battalions were almost never concentrated as envisioned. Instead, they were parceled out in platoon strength for direct fire support. But individual Hellcat crews, using the speed Bruce designed into them, developed their own lethal tactics that proved devastatingly effective. Historian Stephen Zaloga assessed the contradiction with characteristic precision. The Hellcat's combat record, he wrote, is attributable to the training and dedication of its crews, not to its ill-conceived design. The crews had taken a flawed concept and made it work through sheer courage and tactical ingenuity. German commanders who faced American tank destroyers rarely knew what was hitting them. After-action reports typically referred to American armored vehicles generically. The speed and low profile of the Hellcat meant German crews often could not identify what was engaging them before it vanished. The factories that built the Hellcat converted to peacetime production after victory in Europe. Buick returned to making automobiles. Camp Hood became Fort Hood, later renamed Fort Cavazos, and trained soldiers for different wars. The veterans scattered across the country, raised families, built careers, and rarely spoke about the thin-skinned vehicles they had ridden into battle. The strategic implications of what happened at Arracourt and Bastogne extended far beyond the specific engagements themselves. German planners had built their armored forces around the assumption that superior individual vehicles would prevail against numerically superior enemies. They invested enormous resources in heavy tanks that were difficult to manufacture, difficult to transport, and difficult to maintain. When those tanks faced opponents who had optimized for entirely different qualities, the German advantages evaporated. The M18 Hellcat was not designed to win tank duels. It was designed to kill tanks and survive through speed rather than armor. Every design choice reflected that philosophy. The open-topped turret saved weight and allowed the crew better situational awareness. The thin hull armor allowed for a more powerful engine relative to the vehicle's mass. The 76mm gun was adequate against the side and rear armor of any German tank, while being light enough to maintain the vehicle's speed advantage. German engineers, working within a different set of assumptions, made different choices. They built the Tiger to survive frontal hits from any weapon the enemy possessed. They accepted reduced mobility and enormous logistical requirements in exchange for battlefield dominance. On paper, the Tiger should have been superior to the Hellcat in every meaningful category. In practice, the Hellcat's speed allowed it to avoid the situations where the Tiger's advantages mattered. The lessons of this confrontation were not fully absorbed by military planners in the immediate post-war period. The United States Army disbanded its Tank Destroyer Battalions and concluded that the concept had been a failure. The institutional memory of what the Hellcats had accomplished faded as veterans aged and passed away. But the fundamental insight remains valid. Military effectiveness is not determined solely by the specifications of individual weapons systems. Training, doctrine, tactical flexibility, and the courage of the people operating those systems matter as much or more than armor thickness and muzzle velocity. The men who crewed the Hellcats did not think of themselves as proving doctrinal points. They were doing a job, facing an enemy, trying to survive long enough to go home. They climbed into vehicles that offered almost no protection and faced opponents whose weapons could destroy them from ranges where their own guns were ineffective. They developed tactics through trial and error, through watching friends die, through figuring out what worked and abandoning what did not. Lieutenant Leiper, who had awakened to chaos on that foggy September morning in Lorraine, survived the war. So did Sergeant Hartman, who had destroyed 6 German tanks in a single engagement. So did Captain Evans, who later earned the Distinguished Service Cross for manning the gun of a disabled Hellcat rather than abandon the fight. They returned to ordinary lives in an America that quickly forgot what they had accomplished. The primary sources documenting their service remain available for those who seek them. Stephen Zaloga's Patton versus the Panzers provides the definitive account of Arracourt, drawing on German 5th Panzer Army records and American unit histories. William Heistand's M18 Hellcat versus Panther offers tactical analysis of the 704th's engagements against Panzer Brigade 113. Harry Yade's The Tank Killers traces the history of the entire tank destroyer force. Victor Failmezger's American Knights tells the story of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion. The after-action reports for the 704th, 609th, and 705th Battalions rest in the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth and the Eisenhower Presidential Library. The website tankdestroyer.net maintains the largest digital archive of unit histories and veteran narratives, but the truth of what they accomplished needs no archival research to understand. German commanders looked at their heavy tanks and saw superior armor and firepower. They measured combat effectiveness in terms of individual vehicle capabilities. They believed that no enemy could defeat their panzers in direct engagement. They were measuring the wrong things. On a foggy morning in September 1944, a young lieutenant with 4 lightweight tank destroyers faced more than a dozen German heavy tanks. Every expert would have predicted his destruction. Every specification sheet said his vehicles could not survive. 15 German tanks burned on that hillside. Lieutenant Leiper went home. The lesson is simple. Never confuse the machine with the warrior. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.